William Harvey Carney was born on February 29, 1840, in Norfolk, Virginia. At the time of his birth, Virginia was still a slave state. His father, also named William, and his mother, Nancy, were enslaved. The Carney family's lives were dictated not by their own choices, but by the whims of others who claimed ownership of their labor and bodies. From a young age, William displayed traits that would define his later heroism: quiet determination, physical strength, and a deep religious faith. He attended clandestine Bible studies organized by free blacks and sympathetic whites. To Carney, the Bible became not just a source of spirituality, but also of hope. He later wrote, "The same Christ who parted the waters for Moses would one day part the chains of slavery from my people." Norfolk was a bustling seaport filled with wharves, warehouses, and shipyards. But beneath its commerce, the city carried a dark undercurrent. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children who fueled its prosperity. Carney was one of them. His mother Nancy and his father William Sr. were enslaved by different white families. From his first breath, young William inherited the legal status of his mother. He was property. To understand Carney's life in slavery, we must step into the harsh world of antebellum Norfolk. Here, the slave market stood only a short walk from the waterfront. Enslaved people were bought and sold like livestock. Families lived with the constant terror of separation, for a master's debt or whim could scatter parents and children in a single afternoon. Carney's early childhood was shaped by labor. As a boy, he was likely hired out, a common practice in Virginia cities, where slaveholders would rent out enslaved children to ship captains, dock workers, or craftsmen. Carney may have hauled buckets of water, scrubbed decks, or carried heavy loads for merchants. Though only a child, he was expected to work from dawn until dusk. The sounds of Norfolk's harbor, the cry of gulls, the creak of ships' masts, the splash of oars, became the soundtrack of his earliest memories. But alongside the waterfront's commerce came its brutality. Enslaved children were subject to whippings for minor mistakes. Hunger was a constant companion, as rations were meager and overseers quick to punish. Here's an account from a Norfolk traveler during the 1830s. The colored boys along the wharf carried burdens nearly as large as themselves, urged on by the lash. It seemed cruel that children so young should bear such toil. These were the conditions under which William Carney learned endurance, obedience, and silence, but also within him the quiet resolve that he was destined for more. Perhaps the greatest fear of every enslaved family in Norfolk was the auction block. Slave traders made fortunes by transporting enslaved Virginians southward to the cotton plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. For Carney's family, this threat was ever present. He watched neighbors, friends, and perhaps even relatives marched in chains down the very streets he walked, bound for slave ships headed south. A contemporary observer in Norfolk once said, "The saddest sight in our city is the coffles men, women, and children chained 2 by 2, driven like cattle toward the vessels that bear them away." Carney would never forget these images. Later in life, when he reflected on slavery, he often emphasized not just the physical hardships, but the cruelty of tearing families apart. Even in bondage, enslaved people carved out spaces of hope. Carney's parents were deeply religious, and from an early age he attended secret prayer meetings, often held in hidden rooms or wooded clearings outside Norfolk. These gatherings blended African traditions with Christian hymns. Here, Carney first heard passages from the Bible that spoke of deliverance, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, Daniel surviving the lion's den, Christ dying and rising again. For young William, these stories were not abstract theology, they were promises. He later said that the book of Exodus gave him courage, planting in him the belief that slavery would not last forever. Carney once said, "The same God who opened the sea for his children would one day break the chains of mine." Faith then became both a shield and a sword, shielding him from despair and sharpening his sense of destiny. Norfolk's harbour brought enslaved people into contact with sailors, dockhands, and travellers from the north. Some were free black men who carried themselves with a dignity Carney had never seen allowed in Virginia. They earned wages, signed contracts, and spoke openly of their rights. For William, these encounters were transformative. He saw with his own eyes that black men could be free, respected, and self-determining. The turning point came when his father purchased his own freedom. William's father then worked tirelessly, often under brutal conditions, to save enough to free the rest of his family. Eventually, William and his relatives moved northward to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a city known for its abolitionist spirit and whaling industry. But before William left Virginia, he endured years of bondage that tested his body and spirit. These experiences, the lash, the hunger, the auction block, the whispered hymns of deliverance, shaped him into the man who would later seize the flag at Fort Wagner. In New Bedford, Carney experienced freedom for the first time. The city was home to a vibrant free black community and was a hub of the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass himself had lived and spoken there. Carney attended church regularly, sang in the choir, and attended school, something denied to him in Virginia. Education changed him profoundly. He learned to read and write, and for a time considered becoming a minister. He wrote later, "I could best serve God by serving my fellow man. The pulpit called me, but so did the field of battle." Freedom also carried responsibility. Carney knew that while he was free in Massachusetts, millions of African Americans remained enslaved. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Carney recognized that this was no ordinary conflict. It was a war that would decide the future of his people. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, it was more than a moral statement. It authorized the enlistment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. For William Carney, living as a free black man in Massachusetts, the call to arms was not a distant political decree, but a personal summons. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about destroying the institution that had enslaved him and his family. Carney enlisted in February 1863 with the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the first regiment of black soldiers raised in the North. Recruitment posters across Boston and New Bedford bore bold slogans: "Men of Color, to Arms." Abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass urged black men to enlist, arguing that the war was the opportunity to prove their equality on the battlefield. Frederick Douglass said to a crowd of onlookers, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Carney took this to heart. He was among the earliest recruits. His religious devotion impressed officers and comrades alike. Some remembered him as the man who led hymns during evening drills, keeping spirits high when uniforms and pay were delayed for black troops. The 54th trained at Camp Meigs in Redville, Massachusetts. There, Carney endured long days of drill under white officers who doubted at first whether black men could fight effectively. But discipline was rigorous, and the soldiers of the 54th learned to march, maneuver, and fire with precision. The camp was often visited by abolitionists, politicians, and families who came to see this experiment. Carney, tall and dignified, was often pointed out as a model soldier. In May 1863, the regiment left Boston to cheers and parades. Carney recalled the pride he felt marching through the city streets with thousands of people lining the roads. Drums beat, flags waved, and abolitionist leaders shed tears. New England's sons of color were marching to war. Their first missions were not glorious. They were assigned manual labor, fatigue duty, and garrison work. Many soldiers of the 54th grew frustrated, feeling that the army still regarded them as second class. Carney, however, remained steadfast, telling his comrades that patience and faith would win them the chance to prove themselves. That chance came in July 1863 on the sandy shores of South Carolina. Fort Wagner, located on Morris Island near Charleston Harbor, was a Confederate fortress bristling with heavy artillery. To capture it, Union forces had to cross open sand under enemy fire. On July 18, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts was chosen to lead the assault. This decision carried weight. If they succeeded, African-American troops would silence doubters once and for all. If they failed, their critics would claim vindication. As dusk fell, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw addressed his men. Witnesses record him standing tall, his voice steady. The eyes of thousands will look on what we do tonight. Show them that you are men, men who love liberty, men who will fight for it. Forward, 54th. Carney's heart pounded. He knew the dangers. Yet his faith carried him. He prayed quietly, then fixed his eyes on the regimental colors, the United States flag, and the Massachusetts state flag symbols of the cause for which he was ready to die. The attack began at twilight. The 54th advanced across the beach in a narrow column, waves lapping at their sides, Confederate cannons roaring from the fort ahead. The air filled with sand, smoke, and screaming shells. Soldiers dropped by the dozens. Still, the 54th pressed forward. As they neared the fort's ditch, Colonel Shaw climbed atop the parapet, sword in hand, urging his men forward. A moment later, he fell, riddled with bullets. The regiment's color-bearer was struck down almost instantly. The flag began to fall into the sand, a symbol of collapse, of defeat. At that instant, Sergeant William Carney sprang forward. He seized the flag before it touched the ground, raising it high. Musket balls tore through his body, first in the head, then in the chest, then in the leg. Each wound staggered him, but he would not let the flag fall. Here's an eyewitness testimony from a private of the 54th. Amidst the smoke and the storm of battle, I saw Sergeant Carney grasp the colors. Though blood streamed down his face and his legs gave way, still he bore it aloft. His voice was faint but firm. The old flag never touched the ground. For nearly half an hour, Carney held the flag while the regiment was driven back. At last, bleeding profusely, he crawled on hands and knees toward Union lines. Soldiers begged him to drop the flag so they could carry him, but he refused. He collapsed only after he had delivered the flag safely into friendly hands. The assault on Fort Wagner was a tactical failure. The Union suffered over 1,500 casualties, and the 54th lost nearly half its men. Colonel Shaw lay dead, buried in a mass grave with his soldiers. But in moral terms, it was a triumph. The 54th had shown unmatched courage, winning respect for African-American soldiers across the nation. Carney was carried to a field hospital near death. Surgeons marveled that he had survived his wounds. He told them simply, "I did but my duty. The flag never touched the ground." His words spread quickly, repeated in newspapers and sermons across the North. For many, Carney became the embodiment of sacrifice and honor. Carney's heroism was not forgotten. Though it took decades, he was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor in 1900 for his actions at Fort Wagner, making him the first African-American soldier to receive the nation's highest military honor. The citation read simply, "When the color sergeant was shot down, Sergeant Carney grasped the flag, led the way to the parapet, and planted the colors thereon. When the troops fell back, he brought off the flag under a fierce fire in which he was twice severely wounded." For Carney, the medal was not a personal prize, but a symbol of what his people had accomplished. He later said, "This medal I wear is for the race." It tells the story of what the 54th did that night at Wagner.